Lizzie Borden, page 87. You did not answer my question, and you will if I have to put it all day. On August 10th, Lizzie returned to the stand for the second day in a row. Knowlton tried to begin afresh, asking her to relate Thursday morning's evening events once again. Lizzie obliged. She had come downstairs, saw her father reading the paper, spoken briefly with her stepmother in the dining room about the day's marketing, and gone down cellar to the water closet for about 5 minutes. When she came back, Morse Borden was nowhere in sight, and Lizzie assumed she had gone out. That at least seemed feasible. Then Lizzie began to confound him once more. Knowlton could get almost nothing useful from her regarding the critical minutes between 9:15 and 11. Miss Borden was murdered. Her father, Lizzie thought, had left the house around 10, but Knowlton knew from police witness statements that Mr. Borden had been seen on his usual rounds down street as early as 9:30 that morning. Again and again, Lizzie's answers were infuriatingly terse and matter-of-fact. She answered questions literally to the letter and no further, even when giving more information would have been in her best interest. She would not even commit to having seen Bridget washing the windows, driving Knowlton to the very brink of exasperation. "Do you think she might have gone to work and washed all the windows in the dining room and sitting room, and you not know it?" he asked. "I don't know, I am sure. Whether I should or not, I might have seen her and not know it." Knowlton gave up and began to prod at her whereabouts during the second murder. Without too much trouble, they established that her father had come home and settled down on the couch. Lizzie asked Mr. Borden if he wanted the window left open, then left him to his nap. The flat iron was still not hot enough for her handkerchief, so she went to the barn to look for some lead to make sinkers. Knowlton clearly could not fathom how Lizzie, who had not been inside the barn in 3 months and had not used her fishing lines in 5 years, just happened to choose the very hour of her father's murder to suddenly leave the house and go hunting for lead sinkers. Lizzie freely admitted that nothing in particular had prompted her. "I said to myself, I will go and try to find that sinker. Perhaps by the time I get back the flats will be hot. That's the only reason." And why, incredulous Knowlton wanted to know, did she begin preparing for Monday's fishing trip by looking for old sinkers when she admitted she had not even bought new lines yet? "I thought I would find out whether there were any sinkers before I bought the lines," as he explained, with the frugal logic she learned at her father's knee. "And if there was, I should not have to buy any sinkers." Knowlton dropped the subject and moved on to how Lizzie occupied herself in the loft of the barn while her father was being butchered in the house. 20 minutes seemed an awfully long time to pick over the workbench for a handful of scrap metal. It took longer, Lizzie explained, because she had eaten her pears first. Knowlton balked at that, and once more they sparred, arguing almost like brothers and sisters, as though deliberately trying to irritate each other. "You were feeling better than you were in the morning?" Knowlton asked, calling her upset stomach into question. "I felt better in the morning than I did the night before. But that is not what I asked you. You were then, when you were in that hot loft, looking out of the window and eating 3 pears, feeling better, were you not, than you were in the morning when you could not eat your breakfast?" "I never eat any breakfast." "You did not answer my question, and you will if I have to put it all day. Were you then, when you were eating those 3 pears in the hot loft, looking out of the closed window, feeling better than you were in the morning when you ate no breakfast?" "I was feeling well enough to eat the pears." Lizzie's evasive manner had returned, splitting hairs and offering not one particle more information than Knowlton explicitly requested. Sometimes she gave him none at all, as why she had chosen to eat her pears in the one place where she could not see the house. Lizzie answered, "I cannot tell you any reason," though she did inform Knowlton that she could see the house from the barn window. It was after she finished the pears and turned to the workbench at the other end of the barn that someone might have gone in unnoticed. Then could she explain why she had spent a full 10 minutes at the workbench with her back to the window? "No," Lizzie replied, "only that I can't do anything in a minute." Regardless of whether her answer pointed towards guilt or innocence, District Attorney Knowlton had to ask and re-ask his questions to wrench the most trifling details from his witness. Even when his restraint gave way to badgering, Lizzie relinquished the barest minimum of information. Only when it came time to recount the discovery of her father's body did her composure falter. "I opened the door and rushed back," she said. "Saw his face?" "No, I did not see his face because he was all covered with blood." She had seen nothing else. Not the blood pooling on the floor, the gashes that laid her father's face open, his sliced and dangling eyeball. Nothing of that kind? "No, sir," Lizzie Borden said, and covered her face with her hand. The court waited. It was nearly 2 minutes before she could go on, being entirely decomposed. As the third and final day of the inquest testimony was commencing, on August 11th, Medical Examiner Dolan and Dr. Frank Draper, Medical Examiner of Suffolk County, met at Oak Grove Cemetery. The time had come to perform full and official autopsies on Andrew and Abby Borden. Once more, the Bordens' bodies were stripped, laid out for examination, and reopened from chin to groin. They had not been embalmed, and so there had been nothing but the thick stone walls of the receiving vault to stave off the inevitable decay. After 5 days, their bodies were no longer stiff with rigor mortis due to their far advanced state of decomposition. Miss Borden's brain, Dalton noted, evacuated in a fluid condition, being entirely decomposed. Mr. Borden's brain had also liquefied, but apparently remained inside his skull for the duration of the autopsy. The skin around the wounds had deteriorated enough that the doctors could no longer determine how sharply the edges had been cut. The residue of the couple's week-old breakfast still remained in their bowels. Painstakingly, Dolan and Draper measured, numbered, and assessed each wound. In Mr. Borden's case, the doctors determined the half-dozen disfiguring blows to the face had not been fatal. It was the floor to the temple that crushed his skull into his brain and killed him. On Miss Borden, they discovered a wound no one had seen before, a slice 2.5 inches long and 2.5 inches deep into the flesh of her back, just below the neck. They shaved the back half of Miss Borden's head, exposing the severity of the trauma she'd suffered more clearly than ever before. At the crown of her skull, the skin and bone was slashed into a broad gap shaped like the number 7, and this was not the worst of it. 14 parallel blows to the right side of her skull had obliterated the bone behind Abby Borden's right ear, leaving a hole measuring 4.5 by 5.25 inches. The doctor also noted a few internal idiosyncrasies of little consequence. Mr. Borden had a hernia in his groin, Miss Borden a small fibroid tumor on her wound. Both Bordens had worn false teeth in the upper jaw. Mr. Borden's right lung was glued to his front ribs, while Miss Borden's were bound down behind, but normal. Nothing out of the ordinary for an aged couple a full week post-mortem. But what Dr. Dolman did last of all was quite thoroughly out of the ordinary. He decapitated Andrew and Abby Borden and took their severed heads away with him. I don't know if I could put enough of it together now. On Granite Street, the throngs outside the police station were growing restless. At 3 o'clock, the bulletin board announced that no action had been taken and no verdict had been rendered, and the crowd muttered and grumbled. The Evening Standard reported 20 minutes later yet another carriage pulled into Granite Street. It was becoming a too familiar sight. Emma and Lizzie Borden, accompanied by Miss Brigham, after 2 days of questions, District Attorney Knowlton still had a few more things to ask Lizzie. Miss Borden, Knowlton said inside the courtroom as he neared conclusion, "Of course you appreciate the anxiety that everybody has to find the author of this tragedy, and the questions that I put to you have been in that direction. I now ask you if you can furnish any other fact or give any other, even suspicion, that will assist the officers in any way in this matter." All Lizzie offered was the short story she told Alice Russell about a man she'd seen creeping around the side door of the house when she returned from a visit one night. "Is there anything else that you can suggest that even amounts to anything whatever?" Knowlton asked. There was nothing, and with that Knowlton was finished with her. This time Inspector Doughty and Marshal Hilliard did not escort Lizzie past the fretful crowds and into a carriage bound for 2nd Street. Instead, she was conducted across the hall to the matron's room, where she threw herself down on the lounge, visibly frazzled by the 3-day ordeal. Knowlton and Hilliard considered the evidence before them. 3 days' questioning had proved little more than they already knew. Those who had arrived first on the scene, Miss Churchill, Dr. Bowen, Alice Russell, were still shaken by the experience a week after the murder. By their own admission, their recollections were jumbled and confused, and all three ran into details they could not or would not swear to on the stand. "I'm only guessing," said Dr. Bowen. "I don't know because I was so shocked," said Miss Churchill. Both Alice Russell and Miss Churchill acknowledged that they were not very observant, but the gaps in Alice's memory are startling. Alice, who had tried to loosen Lizzie's dress to keep her from fainting, could not remember a thing about that dress, whether it was light or dark, one piece or two, all the same material or combination. Emma Bowden had not been feeling well that day she took the stand, and after less than 150 questions, in contrast to the 150 he asked Lizzie, Knowlton allowed her to step down. "I have omitted a good many questions I should have asked you on that account," he acknowledged for the record. Uncle Morse answered everything asked of him so freely and confidently as Bridget Sullivan, incriminating no one. His ability was watertight. The owner of number 4 Weymouth Street confirmed that he'd been visiting relatives there from about 9:40 until 11:20 that morning. Uncle Morse's alibi. The rumor that John Morse's alibi was too tight to believe continues to circulate in Fall River and beyond. Not only was he visiting relatives a mile across town who vouched for him, Borden's enthusiasts say, but he remembered the number of the streetcar wagon he rode back to 2nd Street, the number on the conductor's hat, and the names of the 6 priests he spoke to while on board. Although Morse's visit to number 4 Weymouth Street was confirmed by police, the details about the streetcar and the priests really are too good to be entirely true. According to a Fall River Evening News story, a conductor on an eastbound wagon did recall passing a westbound wagon full of priests around 11:22 Thursday morning, but Morse never recited the litany of their names in any of his statements to police or in his court testimony. The number on the wagon and the conductor's hat are also nowhere to be found in the official records. Bertie White had claimed not to know anything about the friction her house had caused with the Borden family. The girl, she thought, had simply never liked her. Lizzie's uncle, Hiram Harrington, whose newspaper interview had been downright vicious, became reluctant to speak unkindly of his niece while under oath. Although he had cut Mr. Borden's acquaintance, and the two men no longer spoke, Harrington explained he remained on good terms with Abby, Emma, and Lizzie. When asked what he'd heard from Lizzie about the trouble over Bertie Whitehead's house, Harrington had nothing specific to say. "I don't know as I could put anything together not to tell you, any more than to tell you there was some difficulty some way. Yes, she sometimes spoke sneeringly about Miss Borden, but he could not recall Lizzie bringing the matter up since the previous winter. None of them spoke much of it," Harrington said, but the difficulties were sometimes mentioned in a joking way. He even went so far as to point out that things had not always been disagreeable in the Borden household. For several years, I guess, of his early marriage with her, everything was very, very pleasant, uncommonly so for our stepmother. The testimony of Augusta Tripp, a longtime friend of Lizzie's, also turned out to be a disappointment. Officer Medley's notes from August 7th record Miss Tripp's statement as follows. "Lizzie told me she thought her stepmother was deceitful, being one thing to her face and another to her back. Lizzie told me her stepmother claimed not to have any influence with her father, but she must have influence with her father, or he never would have given my stepmother's half-sister such a very large sum of money. She said, 'I do not know that my sister or I would get anything in the event of my father's death.'" But on the stand, Miss Tripp disagreed with the officer's version. She did indeed believe those were Lizzie's feelings about Abby Borden, but Miss Tripp had never heard Lizzie actually say so outright, especially not the part about the Borden girls being left penniless upon their father's demise. Miss Tripp had heard that juicy tidbit from her invalid sister, a Miss Poole of New Bedford. Only Miss Hannah Gifford, a cloakmaker, was willing to go on record and quote Lizzie's distaste of her stepmother directly. Miss Borden, Lizzie had once told her, was a mean old thing. "She said that?" Knowlton asked. "She said that, yes. Anything more?" "Well, she says, we stay upstairs most of the time. We stay in our room most of the time. I says, 'You do? Don't you go to your meals?' 'Yes, we go to our meals, but we don't always eat with the family with them. Sometimes we wait until they are through,' she says. And of course, there was the druggist, Ellie Benz, with the story of the young Borden woman who wanted to buy prussic acid the day before the murders. He had not known it at the time, but he was as sure now as he'd been when Officer Harrington brought him into the Borden house. That lady with the peculiar expression around the eyes had been none other than Andrew Borden's daughter. In the end, no one's testimony was as much consequence as Lizzie's and Bridget's. Bridget had laid out a clear framework of the hours leading up to the murder, and little that Lizzie Borden said fit well within it. Lizzie's words did not betray guilt, but they did almost nothing to suggest innocence. Her account of the morning of August 4th was, at the very least, worthy of suspicion. It was not much for Knowlton and Hillard to go on, but it was all they had.